So hopefully I can move a little quicker through cosine. Like sine, cosine goes on forever and ever horizontally. Vertically, it sticks between the y values of -1 and 1. So the cosine function itself does not have an inverse. However, if we restrict cosine's interval to be between 0 and pi, which is right here on the curve, cosine does have an inverse because this would pass the horizontal line test. So cosine is slightly different from sine in the sense that it's similar to sine because the domain of inverse cosine is between -1 and 1. But it's different from sine because the range of inverse cosine is between 0 and pi. And that also ties back to the graphs just being a horizontal transformation, a shift of each other. That's why the interval where they have an inverse is slightly different. So the process to finding the value is the same. The first thing we do is we look at what x value they're trying to put into the function. We know this x value has to be between -1 and 1. So this is good. If you were to divide √2 by 2, you get what do we get? I forget what we get, but √2 divided by 2 is between -1 and 1. So that's a good value. So we're going to ask ourselves the question, when does the cosine of an angle equal √2 over 2? Now back from my unit circle, these numbers look familiar. I know it's a form of a 45. So I come over to my unit circle. But the difference here now is cosine's inverse exists up here between 0 and pi. So √2 over 2, form of a 45. Cosine, I know, is adjacent over hypotenuse. So the adjacent is √2 and the hypotenuse is 2. So I'm going, and actually I know it's a 45. I know the hypotenuse is not 2. So I know this is a +1 and this is a √2. So my answer here is 45 degrees or pi over 4 in radians. When I look at part B, cosine, inverse cosine of -1. Well, again, I look at my x value. Is this x value between -1 and 1? Yes, that's good, so I can move on. I'm asking my question. When does cos of an angle equal -1? Well, for it to equal, I go back to what I know about cosine. I know cosine is adjacent over hypotenuse. For something to equal 1 or -1, I know the hypotenuse has to be 1. So if this is -1, I know the adjacent side has to be a -1, which brings me back to my unit circle. -1, the adjacent side is always the x. I'm going over here, -1, 0. I know I'm only allowed between 0 and pi, hence my answer is pi radians or 180 degrees.